Good morning, and thank you all for joining us for today's BizTalk Series webcast, ESB Toolkit 2.1, presented by Brendon Birdoes. My name is Meredith Mead, and I'm the Marketing Coordinator for Neudesic and the moderator for today's webcast. This webcast is presented by Brendon Birdoes, Neudesic's Regional Practice Director of the Service Delivery Group. If you're all logged in, you should be able to see the title slide that states Neudesic, ESB Toolkit 2.1. There was a brief intro earlier regarding features within Live Meeting. To briefly recap, we encourage you to ask questions throughout the session by typing them in. To ask a question, click on the Q&A verbiage located in the toolbar on the top left side of your screen. Type your question, then click the Ask button. Please note all questions will be held until the end. We will also be using the seating chart feature within Live Meeting. Changing your feedback color within this tool provides feedback to the presenter. To provide feedback, click on the feedback menu found in the upper right-hand corner of your screen. Select your feedback color. Your seat in the conference center will display your selected color. Lastly, this webcast is being recorded and will be available via the Neudesic website. We will email you when the link is available. If everyone is ready, please make sure your seat color is green. At this time, I'd like to turn our presentation over to Brendon. Brendon? Not sure if we can hear you.
Is this better?
Yes, much better.
The classic mute button issue. Okay, well, welcome everyone to this session on ESB Toolkit 2.1, where we dive into the features and capabilities of the ESB Toolkit for BizTalk Server 2010. So first, just a little bit about myself. Meredith gave a brief introduction. I'm currently the Desert Mountain Regional Practice Director, where we cover primarily Phoenix and Las Vegas regions, and our focus is connected systems for my region, for my practice. I was the lead BizTalk developer on ESB Toolkit 2.0, so if you've been following ESB Toolkit, there were significant investments by Microsoft from the 1.0 version to the 2.0 version, and I was able to participate with the Patterns and Practices group on that effort. I'm currently a Microsoft BizTalk Virtual Technology Specialist, and have been doing software development pretty much focused on Microsoft solutions for about 10 years now. So what we're going to cover today, first we're going to just talk a little bit about what the ESB Toolkit 2.1 is. Again, it's not a widely known feature of BizTalk, so we're just going to cover and get some ideas of what it is. Then we'll go into some features and capabilities to understand what you're going to get from the ESB Toolkit. And then talk about what are the benefits, why would I consider using ESB Toolkit in my environment. And then we'll finish up with taking a deeper look at itinerary-based routing. This is one of the core features of the ESB Toolkit 2.1. So I want to make sure that we go through, and we'll have a demo at that point, and get a little bit of a feel for what it's like to work within the ESB Toolkit. And there will be some learning resources at the end, and just some basic pointers on where you might want to go to get further information. Okay, so I think any discussion around ESB Toolkit, it's always good to really try to level set and understand, this concept of ESB, and I think it really starts with this general architectural pattern of a bus. And I think, many people have probably seen similar graphics where the idea is we're plugging in systems to the bus and not connecting directly, where we no longer are point to point. And really using the bus as that conduit to communicate between the various systems. And really the key benefits around that are decoupling the client and service. And just from that little step of further decoupling client and service, we get a lot of power and a lot of capability. Much easier to manage as connections grow. So if we have changes in the location of servers or environments or services, Managing that change, now you're dealing with that change in one point versus potentially spread out through your entire enterprise. And I've definitely been in complex network environments where sometimes changing the location could be a significant effort, which meant opening ports and firewalls in different environments. So the idea of potentially connecting and opening up many different ports instead of just the one for the ESB definitely can be an advantage. Changes in services, allowing your service capabilities to evolve independent from the client, maybe incrementing the version and adding new capabilities, but still supporting the previous client. A lot of those decisions and choices that you'll make get a little bit easier once you decouple that client and service with the bus pattern. So one of the targets or one of the general goals we always like to hope for when we go into like a service-oriented initiative or environment is the idea of reuse. So things like potentially exposing significant business events in your environment, maybe a new employee event that many different systems might need to get to. What you can do is essentially leverage all that work that you did to expose the event, which we know a lot of times that's where most of the work is done, just to get that new hire event available to other systems. So things like that become a little bit easier to reuse across the enterprise when you publish that message out to, or that business event out to a bus. Protocol bridging is another common thing you might do where you might have a back-end SAP system which, it has its own way to communicate with the outside world, and really that bus, through maybe an adapter or something like that, will be able to reach in and expose some of those capabilities. And we all know any environments with an SAP or back-end ERP type system, there's a lot of functionality there that you want to reach and get into from external systems. So really just trying to enable that reuse through the capabilities of the bus. And in the end, the goal is to improve that agility, the ability to make changes and move with the business, and come back with estimates that we're talking more weeks and months versus months and years. So just kind of looking at the capabilities of an ESB, and really I tend to think of it as a collection of patterns and practices and capabilities focused more on the messaging and integration space. So this really gives a good overview of kind of what you're looking for and capabilities you would expect in an ESB. So from a service-oriented architecture side, which has definitely become much more mainstream in the communication style, very much standards-based, message-oriented type message using the SOAP protocol, very important capability of any ESB at this point to evolve past potentially a very proprietary message-based communication. So something you definitely would want to look for in an ESB. And then enterprise application integration. I think we all think of BizTalk in this space, but still very important aspect of any ESB, potentially using adapters to be able to integrate and reach out to many different types of systems. Transformation and rules engines really to enable content-based type routing and other capabilities and getting messages to the right format. And then the very kind of the roots of a lot of the stuff we do today with ESB coming from the message-oriented middleware, where key concepts like publish, subscribe, and intelligent routing were introduced. And then I think a little bit less prevalent, but a very important idea of event-driven architecture. I kind of talked about that a little bit before, of exposing business events and really looking at an ESB as enabling that complex event processing and really just exposing all these different events and having systems react to those events in your enterprise. So I think it's good to look at BizTalk without necessarily even including the ESB Toolkit and look at what it has to offer for this concept of ESB, and really some key capabilities that I think really puts it in that space where it can definitely fulfill that role as an ESB. So things like the WCF adapters that were introduced in 2006 R2 were very kind of a key enabler to bringing BizTalk into that service-oriented world, moving beyond just classic ASMX and being able to understand all the different standards and new capabilities they were introducing with the SOAP standards and the web service standards. And really, as we talked about earlier, that kind of loosely coupled standard-based messaging. And then powerful pub sub engine. Really, if you look at an ESB, this is one of the most common features and patterns that you think about within an ESB. And anyone who has used BizTalk knows that the pub sub engine in BizTalk is very powerful. A lot of different options there with filters and message context properties and message based routing with the content of the message. So very powerful and very capable feature set you have within BizTalk for fulfilling this role. And then the traditional things we think about with enterprise application integration and really the roots of BizTalk, the idea of the adapters and the business rules engine, and of course the very powerful BizTalk mapping tool, which if anyone watched my previous webcast in December, we spent a lot of time looking at the new capabilities of the mapping tool. And really, if you haven't seen it, definitely look into it. It's a lot of good new stuff, a lot of usability capabilities there that are very important if you're doing any type of mapping. So just taking a look at ESB Toolkit 2.1 and what it has to, or just really what is it about. And I think really an important aspect of ESB Toolkit 2.1 that really kind of gives you an idea of what it is and what its purpose is the idea that it's owned and was originally owned by Patterns and Practices Group. And really what that tells you is what ESB Toolkit is capable of. So the group generally will go out and look at different technologies and frameworks used within the industry. So something like the .NET framework or SharePoint or even application architecture, those type of things. They want to get that feedback, go out, see how the products are used or the framework, and really start building up best practices and guidance around that. Sometimes, as we've seen, that results in maybe a document like the application architecture guide, or it ends up in tooling like the enterprise library. And in this case, really with ESB Toolkit, they looked at how BizTalk was being used in the industry, and actually Neudesic was engaged pretty heavily in the initial creation of the ESB Toolkit, and really trying to talk to different experts in the industry and understand how BizTalk was being used and what is the best way to build solutions within BizTalk. And really that's what you see in ESB Toolkit is really trying to package up some of those key patterns and capabilities and best practices in building solutions, and then build up some tooling around that. And even in from the shift from 1.0 to 2.0, we saw a significant investment in the installation process, and so that's essentially what we got was this installable package of these best practices and patterns. One of the key capabilities that really seems to provide a lot of value, and one of the key features I really think is important to note about the ESB Toolkit is easing message-based communication. And really what that is this concept of, the first time I got into BizTalk, I very much spent most of my time in orchestration. And it wasn't until, much later that I realized, a lot of times I just want to move a message around and transform it and potentially make a decision about where it needs to go. And then realize that, I don't need an orchestration for that all the time. So really kind of removing that need for orchestration for everything I would do, and just focus more on that message-based communication, using receive and send ports and the powerful subscription engine to move things around in BizTalk. And really, there's certain scenarios, especially like service pass-through, where you just don't want to get a significant amount of artifacts and orchestration involved. You want the messages to be able to flow onto the bus very easily and off very easily. So I think really, when you start looking at one of the key capabilities, you definitely want to look at ESB Toolkit when those scenarios arise to kind of increase the amount of work you can do without needing orchestration. So originally it was built for BizTalk Server 2009. So there is an ESB Toolkit 2.0 that had really that was where the significant investment was made from the original ESB Guidance 1.0 to the ESB Toolkit 2.0, and that's that BizTalk Server 2009 was where that was really introduced. And then, of course, they have upgraded it, so the 2.1 is built for BizTalk 2010 and only targets BizTalk 2010. So some of the new features that are in the 2010 release include, obviously the update for the BizTalk 2010 platform, and then designer support for Visual Studio 2010. So many of you might know that the Visual Studio went through a complete revamp to use WPF as the basis for the IDE, and so the designer had to kind of be reworked and updated for that environment. So they do have a BizTalk project as well. That was one of the complaints from 2009 where there wasn't a specific project for itineraries, so that was introduced. And then also a nice new features, and we'll get into itinerary development, but there's copy and paste capabilities, so some nice usability there. So, really we talked about the ESB and that concept as kind of a general collection of implemented patterns and practices. And so this actually calls out some of the different capabilities and patterns that you're going to get with the ESB Toolkit. And really there's a whole list here, but there's a few that I want to call out that I think are really key and core to what you get with ESB Toolkit. The first is the routing slip pattern, and we'll go over that one a little bit, but that's really the basis for itinerary-based development and routing, which is a core capability of BizTalk, or of the ESB Toolkit. Repair and resubmit is another one, very common pattern in messaging where, a lot of times we have one-way asynchronous messaging going on behind the scenes where really you don't have that user to sit and wait for a response or to make sure a transaction went through. So, we really want that comfort that the right things are happening behind the scenes. So repair and resubmit is a common way to deal with errors within the messaging world, where essentially we capture the issue, route the message to somewhere where we can take a look and potentially fix something in the message and resubmit and hopefully reach our final destination successfully. So that's another pattern you're going to get with the exception management aspects and the management portal of the ESB Toolkit. So very common capability that people look for ESB Toolkit to provide, again, along with that routing slip. And then another one I think that's very much worth calling out is the two patterns, content-based router and rule centralization. And really the key I would call out there is the fact that the ESB Toolkit does a really good job of bringing the rules engine into play much easier. So I think a lot of times within BizTalk, we know we have this very powerful rules engine, but the amount of clients and people I run into that actually use it seem to not be as high as you would expect, especially given the capabilities. And I think one of the things, as I mentioned, the ESB Toolkit really makes it very easy to bring in the BRE or Business Rules Engine into things like content-based routing, and as we'll see, other aspects of the routing slip or itinerary-based development. So very powerful features where essentially using that BRE becomes very, very easy to include in your solution. So I won't spend too much time with this. There's a whole lot of stuff on this slide that we could talk about, but really what's important to note is that the ESB Toolkit is built on top of BizTalk. So the key capabilities like the rules engine, the pub sub engine, the idea of adapters and transformation and orchestration, all of these key things that we get from BizTalk, ESB Toolkit does not change the game. Some folks have asked me, do we get low latency or can we bypass the message box, those type of things, and really that's not what ESB Toolkit was set out to solve. Really it was making sure that we could better utilize and build our solutions using best practices, and that means utilizing the orchestration engine, the rules engine, the powerful pub sub engine. So definitely something to keep in mind, and for anyone who knows BizTalk, you're way ahead of the game on understanding ESB Toolkit. There are some frameworks involved, and really what's key to understand is that there essentially was introduced in 2.0 was really the extensibility idea that resolvers, adapter providers, which are key to the ESB Toolkit, and we'll go over those a little bit more. Really it is a framework, so how the ESB development team, Toolkit development team developed and created their itinerary services and resolvers and adapter providers is really the exact same way that you might potentially extend the ESB Toolkit. We really tried to follow that open-closed principle to make sure that all of any adapter providers, resolvers, and itinerary services created by clients really are kind of first-class citizens and not treated any differently than anything that the team built. And then there's other key components of exposing the on-ramps, and we'll talk about on-ramps a little bit as well. And the management portal tends to be a very popular feature of the ESB Toolkit, just based on a lot of the capabilities it gives you around about viewing exceptions and potentially resubmitting them. So another nice feature of the toolkit. So some of the resolvers included in the ESB Toolkit, and at this point, some of them were in 1.0 and some introduced in 2.0, but all of these are going to be in ESB Toolkit 2.1. And really the key there is to understand there is integration with UDDI 3.0. So we did see an update in 2009 to the UDDI standard, which is a capability of BizTalk now. And there is integration with resolvers with UDDI. You notice there's BRE as well, again, making it much easier to reach out to a policy to potentially use as a resolver. And then, of course, static. And what's really nice is we've introduced the idea of using resolvers with itineraries. So we'll talk about that a little bit more as well. So some nice capabilities there, and you can kind of see the breadth of the type of resolvers you might get. We also have adapter providers, and really the adapter providers are important for exposing the different type of adapters to the ESB Toolkit. So this is something that's important to note, is that the adapter concept and idea within BizTalk is really a key integration capability. So out of the box, these adapter providers allow ESB Toolkit to work with and understand the adapters. Really, it's all about the setting the right message context properties and allowing the right things to happen from that perspective. But do note that the ESB Toolkit doesn't work out of the box with just any adapter. These are the key ones out of the box, and this can definitely be extended. But one that is nice is the WCF custom, which really, as we look to the line of business adapters and any other future WCF adapters, there is the WCF custom, which really gives you access to those. Probably a little bit more configuration out of the box needed for the WCF custom, but really it does expose out all those different types of WCF adapters that might be coming and are already existing. So some of the key features and capabilities, itinerary-based routing, we'll talk about that a bit more and go into a demo, but really a key way to do work and get things, move messages around within and utilizing ESB Toolkit. There is a Visual Studio Designer for itineraries, which was introduced with the 2.0 version, and probably one of the most significant improvements that we got with the 2.0 release. There is a full exception handling framework, so we'll show that in the demo a little bit, and that's very common that that clients will just install the exception management aspect and not use the itinerary routing aspect. So something definitely to keep in mind if you're looking for some sort of exception handling capabilities. There's plenty there with the ESB Toolkit. We have server-side itineraries, which is really moving itineraries away from client-side. And again, the itineraries are really kind of decide and move messages through through BizTalk. So originally those were included with the client, so you would send a message that included the itinerary, which you can imagine isn't the best way to manage itineraries by pushing them out to clients. So with we now have the server-side injection of itineraries, which is a very important feature. Some of the core service capabilities like transformation, the resolution engine are exposed as web services. I talked about the better extensibility, so as you create adapters or resolvers to extend the system or potentially itinerary services, really you do that the same way the team did. Performance and quality improvements, this was really, again, probably bigger improvement from 1.0 to 2.0, but a lot of time was spent on those capabilities and really trying to make it more enterprise ready. And then the improved installation. So we've now gone from a very manual or script-based process to using an MSI and a configuration tool, which is definitely better than script-based installation. There are some key samples that are included. So one thing to note, the management portal is a sample, but it does give you that resubmit and visibility to the exceptions. And a lot of times you'll actually see in the this installed and be one of the more important features. So they've really elevated the installation process. So from many newcomers to the ESB Toolkit, it will almost seem like it's a core part of the actual toolkit. Itinerary sample, definitely something to look at if you want to go further. And then message enrichment and multiple web services further explore some of the capabilities of itinerary-based routing. And then, of course, the exception management aspect, which, as I mentioned, a very key feature. So the exception management will explore those capabilities, the sample. So, really what are the benefits? Why might I think about using the ESB Toolkit 2.1? I think, the reduction in development time, obviously there's some learning curve aspects, so don't completely disregard that initial ramp up. There'll be some time spent there. But overall, once you get comfortable, there are pre-built patterns and capabilities, and as I mentioned, easier exposure to using the rules engine. The designer aspects as well definitely have helped that development time and building up itineraries. So, there's that definite possibility of reducing that development time and going back to kind of that message-based communication.
Hey, Brendon, we may have lost your audio. Sorry, everyone. Just one moment, please, as we try and fix the audio.
Sorry about that. Hopefully everyone can hear me. My audio stopped there for a minute. Okay, perfect. Okay, so everyone can hear me again. Sorry about that. So I think I stopped off at the reduction of BizTalk artifacts and configuration. So really the key features there of the ESB Toolkit is the introduction of the idea of on-ramps, and really an on-ramp is really just an endpoint available. Usually you'll look into something like WCF that really can receive any message as long as the client can understand whatever protocol that is, like the WS standards, or can work with a WCF endpoint. And really, you're not looking for a specific message type. It's just an endpoint that accepts messages. And what you can do at that point is inject itineraries to move the message around within BizTalk. So really, you can see that potential for a reduction of the amount of receive locations that you have to set up. And then really, you're driving and moving messages around using the powerful subscription engine. Instead of very focused binding from an orchestration to a receive location. So much more advanced way to do things, and again reduces the amount of receive locations. And off-ramps is kind of that same idea, but sending messages out from BizTalk using the concept of dynamic send ports within BizTalk, which are a great way to reduce the amount of send ports you need. And there's a whole routing aspect and service that allows you to set up your message to go to an off-ramp using the right protocols and right adapter, and we'll show that in the demo. And then a reduction of errors. This one would probably be more significant from the 1.0 to 2.0 release, but still the fact that you are using the designer, and there is some integration with BizTalk, so you're actually pointing to a BizTalk instance and picking out the maps that are deployed versus needing to type it in. So a nice capability there to help with the development and reduce the amount of time you spend debugging itineraries. So we're getting close to a demo, so thanks for hanging in there. So I wanted to talk next about the itinerary-based routing. As I mentioned, this is really the primary way you do things within the toolkit as far as development aspects. So what itinerary-based routing is essentially an implementation of the routing slip pattern. And really the concept there is to attach an itinerary or this routing slip to a message coming into the bus. And on that itinerary slip will essentially be the different steps and operations and work that you want to do on that message. So, the key ones that we'll see that are included are things like transformation, very common, and routing, which is really setting up and routing a message to an off-ramp and setting it up to be sent using a certain adapter or protocol. So really that's what that routing slip is those steps you're going to go through while you're on the bus. And it utilizes the pub sum engine. That's really how it's going to move things around within BizTalk. So you have a very loosely coupled solution. You're no longer binding orchestrations directly to receive locations. Very much it's just using basic publishing to the message box. And if an orchestration is needed, it's just using certain filters to pick up that message, or the off-ramps, you're using that same kind of very loosely coupled filters to receive the right messages. And then the other nice thing is it gets a little bit easier to do work in a pipeline with the introduction of messaging services. And as a potential step, it gets a little bit easier to develop and do work within the pipeline. So what are the key things on the itineraries? Really, we have our orchestration services. So these are the typical orchestrations that we've used before. It's just a way of exposing them and making them visible to an itinerary. And then messaging services, and that's simply just a way to put a step within a pipeline and it gets executed within that receive or send port. And those are really the two key things that actually do work on a message within the ESB Toolkit. So again, the same type of concepts we're used to in BizTalk, potentially doing work in a pipeline or potentially utilizing orchestrations. The adapter framework we talked about, and it's really exposing certain adapters and making them available to the ESB Toolkit, potentially for routing purposes. So we can see the ones out of the box that are included. And then the resolver framework, really where that comes into play, we did discuss a little bit, what certain resolvers exist and what technologies they can use, but really the resolver exists to provide information to the itinerary services at runtime so they can complete their work. So a good example of that is if we have a transformation step or messaging service, the key information I'm going to need is the actual map I'm going to use to execute against the message. So at runtime, I can use that resolver framework. I can potentially reach out to BRE to look at the message or message context to determine which transformation I want to use. So again, you can see that very dynamic nature of making decisions at runtime based on something about the message. So we're going to see, we're in just a minute here, developing itineraries. We've moved away from this XML-based type editing to an actual designer-based editing. So very much a significant improvement where we're now dragging and dropping and giving more visual aspect of the message moving through BizTalk, which of course is much better than hand coding XML. So let's go ahead and take a look at itinerary-based routing within the ESB Toolkit. There we go. Hopefully everyone can see my screen. Okay. So I have a basic scenario set up here, and nothing too complicated, but the general idea is I have a new customer table that's going to be receiving events. We'll just show that. So this essentially would be essentially where I'm exposing that new customer event to the bus. It could be an SAP type system pushing it there. Could be any type of HR based system or even a CRM system, sorry. So the general idea is this is where we're exposing that event to the bus. So I want to be able to read that information and then potentially push it off to a different system. In this case, I'm just going to flow it to another table, the customers table, essentially pushing it into the Northwind customers table. So to do that, I'm going to use the WCF SQL adapter. I'm going to use a polling adapter on the new customer side, and then send it out again, all using ESB Toolkit to the customer page or customers table. So to accomplish that, I put together a little project, and really the first thing I want to call out is the key artifacts. If you notice, to do the work, I have some transformations. So I've got my core common customer, common pattern to use, kind of a canonical schema or kind of a well understood definition of customer. So I've got my new customer, which is essentially coming from the table, being translated into a customer, and then we'll move it over to the right format to actually insert it into the customers table. The important thing to note here is you don't see any orchestration. So I'm doing this all with schema and transformation, and I'll utilize itineraries to actually move that message through BizTalk. So let's go ahead and add a new itinerary. So we'll just go ahead and give it a name. So we have the designer surface. And we're going to have the key toolbox with the core things we need. So let's go ahead and start getting a feel of what it's like to build up an itinerary. So the first thing we want to drag on is an Onramp. This is essentially that receive location that's going to receive the message. So I'll choose the Onramp extender. The nice thing you'll notice that at this point it's actually hooked up to my BizTalk system. So I can actually pick out the BizTalk application and the Onramp that I'm going to use to receive the message. And one nice thing we'll see is that as we move through this and build this out, we'll get a nice visual of and documentation of our message moving through the system. A lot of times if you have a lot of receive ports and send ports and orchestrations, it's really hard to understand the path through BizTalk that the message is going to take. So that really what we get out of this is that side effect of documentation. So let's go ahead, and the first step we want to do is transform that into the common customer. So in this case, I'm not going to use orchestration. I'm going to try to keep it to just messaging. The container is essentially saying where I want to execute this step. So we'll do it on the receive. And then we want to identify which itinerary service we want to use. Oh, I'm sorry, I dragged the wrong one on. Not going to use a broker. We want to use an itinerary step. So you see here out of the box we have routing, which again is setting it up to potentially be routed and used for an off-ramp. I'm going to do a transformation. We'll set the receive location. So you can see kind of the key capabilities. I want to run a transform within that on-ramp or that receive location on the receive handler. So I'm going to need a resolver. So I know I need to run a transformation. And then the resolver is what I'm going to use to tell me what is the actual transformation I want to use. So we have a couple different options. As I mentioned, we could use the BRE. In this case, I'm just going to essentially use what's equivalent to hard coding within the itinerary, which is the static. And then I'll go ahead and choose the transformation type. So again, if you notice the nice usability here, I'm pointed to a local BizTalk server, and it's actually looking up all the different transformations that I could potentially use. So in this case, I want the new customer to customer. So now I've got that step set up. I'll go ahead and connect the two. And then the next piece is I want to route it. So I've got it transformed. Now I want to essentially route it to an off-ramp to use the WCF SQL off-ramp, or actually just a general off-ramp. So we'll go ahead and use the messaging extender. We'll go ahead and do this work still in the receive handler because you want to do these routing type steps in the receive handler where it sets up the right properties within the message. And then as you can see, we're going to use the routing. So we'll go ahead and use the static resolver here again. And at this point, I'm not going to go through and fill all this out, but I'll show you a completed one here in just a second. But what's important to see is that at this point, I can utilize the adapter framework. So these are all the different adapters that are registered and available to ESB Toolkit. So I can go ahead, in this case, use the WCF custom adapter to potentially work with WCF SQL. So for time's sake, let's go ahead and look at a completed itinerary of what it's actually going to look like. Oops. Let's do open with. There we go. Okay. So this looks a little bit better. But again, what's key to understand is you can actually see the flow of the message. We do a transformation. we want to route to the new customer, or essentially the off-ramp. And then from there, I'm going to do a transformation on that off-ramp to get it into the correct format for that insert customer. So very nice. I get a full flow of the system. Taking a look at the off-ramp and on-ramp, and really it's fairly simplistic. I have a receive location set up to pull the actual table. Now in this case it's not completely generic, but I am still using this receive pipeline which injects the itinerary, so that I could potentially still make different decisions about which itinerary and which path it goes through the system. And then in this case, though, I'm just essentially attaching the same itinerary each time. So that's essentially my on-ramp, and it's this receive pipeline and pipeline that was included with the ESB Toolkit that essentially makes it itinerary aware. On the send port side, we do have a generic off-ramp here, and if you do notice, this is just a dynamic one-way port. It does use the itinerary send pass-through, which again makes it itinerary aware, but this is not a specific send port for a specific type of adapter. So this idea of just being able to send many messages through or different types is introduced. So we can see that my customer table has a bunch of information, but let's go ahead and put this new customer in. So I'll move this to 0, and then hopefully in just a second here we'll see that message move through BizTalk using the itinerary to route it out. So we see that as processed, and then on the customer side we see that inserted. And again, the only thing I'm using at this point is this itinerary to move it through and utilize the different receive and send ports. Another nice capability, and I'll just kind of touch on it here, is the exception management capabilities. So in this case, let's go ahead and push this back to 0. So it'll try to process it again. And really, there's kind of two key aspects to the exception management. There is an included send port that's really just listening for all exceptions. So this utilizes BizTalk's capabilities to actually use promoted properties and identifying errors through fault information in the message. So this is just wiring up basically to anything that has fault information. It's going to go ahead and take that fault and then push it into a set of tables that record pretty much everything you want to know about that message. So this is just kind of the summary table that includes, the description of the error, what kind of fault it was. There's other tables and information with the different context properties of the messages, and a lot of times folks will use, or clients will use the management portal to see this information. But the main reason I did want to show this is there's options. It does get pushed into a table. You could create your own SSRS for type reports if that works better for you to receive that information. So very nice in this case where I had an exception because the customer was already inserted, and now it immediately gets routed to my exception database. Okay. So let's go ahead back to the slides. There we go. And just a little bit more about itineraries. We did talk about, what's that kind of experience of developing and then potentially deploying. And that's one thing I want to call out, that essentially you have your design time experience, which we saw with the Visual Studio Designer. From there, you can actually push it out to an itinerary repository, and that's where BizTalk is going to look for that itinerary, which is essentially just a SQL backend store. So generally, that's what you're going to do, is push it to this repository, and then from there, it does get injected at runtime. Usually you're going to use something like the itinerary selector on your Onramp to determine which itinerary to use. But again, that itinerary repository is kind of your deployment location for those itineraries. And the key piece there is that you now have a single place you're deploying these itineraries instead of potentially including them with clients. So some various resources you want to look at. Obviously, the ESB Toolkit homepage and documentation. There's plenty of information on the forums as well as far as questions. There's a specific forum just for the toolkit. I do have some information on my blog, especially if you're interested in extending the framework or the ESB Toolkit doing a messaging service, which again is a capability that executes within a pipeline. I do have a very extensive sample on my blog that shows how to get designer support and how to use it at runtime as well. So just a quick summary. Really we see that BizTalk is a loosely coupled messaging engine, and ESB Toolkit is built on top of BizTalk to really allow those best practices to be implemented fairly easily in your BizTalk solutions. There's some significant capabilities like the exception management and itinerary capabilities that it adds to BizTalk 2010. And then if you're interested in getting up to speed, the samples really are crucial to understanding how to develop, use orchestrations, use itineraries, utilize exception management framework, and those type of capabilities within the ESB Toolkit. I want to thank everyone for your time, and I believe at this point we can open it up for questions.
Thank you, Brendon, for this awesome presentation. Just as a reminder to everyone to ask a question, click on the Q&A verbiage located in the toolbar on the top left side of your screen, type your question, and then click the Ask button. One of the questions that we did have come through was, at what point would you recommend a business to look into or implement the ESB Toolkit?
So that's a great question. And really there's kind of two key things I would want to understand is, what's your capability with BizTalk already? So if you're just getting introduced to BizTalk, throwing ESB Toolkit in right away might be difficult. It is based and built on top of BizTalk, so if you don't have that core understanding of how to use the pub sub-engine, move and utilize orchestrations and water pipelines and receive ports, it definitely gets a little bit more difficult. So you definitely want to have some basis or foundation within BizTalk. And then from there, I think, really it's understanding what you're trying to do. I always tell people that ESB Toolkit is not the solution you use for everything. So once you have it and understand it, it's not, okay, now I solve everything using ESB Toolkit. There's great use cases for it. I mentioned kind of that message-based communication or service pass-through, using concepts of being able to get messages on the bus much easier with on-ramps, essentially just exposing that endpoint. So really it's understanding what you need to do, and then understanding what ESB Toolkit is good at, and then really just determining that it's worth the effort at that point to bring it in. And I will say the learning curve and effort has gotten much better. There's much more resources, and installation and other things are much easier to deal with than they used to be. Not perfect, but definitely better.
Thanks, Brendon. That sounds very helpful. Another question that came through was, how does ESB Toolkit compare to N Service Bus and mass transit?
So I think, I always kind of take the approach with those type of questions is I would do a comparison of BizTalk versus N Service Bus. I haven't used N Service Bus extensively. We have our own product, Neuron ESB, and again, I try to look at BizTalk as a platform versus an Service Bus or something else, and really I think that's the important question. ESB Toolkit does add capabilities, but it doesn't change The fact that you have receive location, you have a message box, which is a SQL server, and orchestration. So I think really I would start the question there, and at that point you do have to look at things of capabilities of the platform of BizTalk, like transformation engine, and having those capabilities, orchestration, those type of things, versus what End Service Bus would have to offer.
Thanks, Brendon. Another question that came through is, what are the pros and cons of BizTalk ESB Toolkit and Neudesic ESB? I believe maybe Neuron?
Neuron.
Yeah. And how would you compare them?
That's probably a longer conversation. I think, to kind of summarize, again, I would focus the conversation on BizTalk versus Neuron. So, Neuron's very much based on WCF and introducing ESB-like capabilities to the WCF platform. So things like pub sub, transformation, pipelines, content-based routing. It really introduces a lot of those capabilities to WCF. Tends to be a little bit lighter weight than BizTalk, but of course with BizTalk we get great things like the durable message box, BAM, business activity monitoring, the BAM portal. So really, again, it's kind of understanding what's important to the solution, and really just kind of applying what each product is good at, and figuring out what's the best fit. And sometimes it's both.
Thank you. Another question was, how backward compatible are Toolkit 1.0 developed items and Toolkit 2.1, and what types of compatibility will be preserved in newer versions?
Great question. So there is backward compatibility for itineraries. If you developed or extended the ESB Toolkit 1.0, most likely it's not going to work. You will have to adjust it to 2.0. But other things like orchestrations, which again is more based on the pub sub engine, there'll be minor adjustments to work with the itinerary. But you will have, again, the itinerary services of orchestration and messaging services, adapters, resolvers, those will probably have to be changed if you extend it. But the itineraries from 1.0 should be preserved. We did a lot of testing on that to make sure that they will transport and work within the 2.0. But the big thing I would say is look at the strict capabilities. So the 1.0 was kind of very loose about where things executed and just really kind of did it in order. So the ESB Toolkit 2.0 introduced the idea of strict itineraries and gave you a little bit more capability around where you execute especially the messaging service steps.
Thank you. Another question, itineraries exclusive to the toolkit. Is that a name for a collection of pipelines, etc.?
So itineraries are exclusive to the toolkit in a sense that what you saw with the designer and those capabilities are definitely exclusive. Now, the itinerary pattern is not. So, it is probably possible to utilize pipelines another way in kind of an itinerary-like fashion, but I wouldn't say an itinerary is a collection of pipelines and orchestration, though. I would say it's a collection of steps that you're going to work through on the bus. And the main reason I say that is that you could execute 10 different messaging steps within one pipeline. So I can build a transformation step. Well, that's already included, but you could run a transformation step. I could build a custom step to actually, maybe log out information to BAM, which is my sample on my blog, and then run the routing service step. So, you see essentially in one pipeline, you're running 3 different steps. So, those steps might be run in a pipeline or they might be routing it to an orchestration, but I would definitely think of it as kind of independent somewhat of pipelines and orchestration as the steps.
Thank you. Another question, does deploying the itinerary create the BizTalk artifacts like the receive location, or just find the pipeline to the receive location you create ahead of time?
Good question. So, ideally we're working with receive on-ramps and on-ramps and off-ramp concepts. So ideally you're creating this off-ramp, which is essentially a dynamic send port. Now you do have to do that beforehand. So I went out there and set up a send port before I built my itinerary to look for certain filters, which made it essentially available to the toolkit. Same with the receive location. I went in and added it and included the right pipelines for the ESB toolkit. So there are some knowledge there that you need to gain around understanding what are the pipelines that make it ESB toolkit aware and what do they provide. But there is that pre-step of setting those up.
Another question, are you aware of any 64-bit versus 32-bit deployment and or operational issues with the itinerary components?
There shouldn't be any issues there. Where I tend to say you got to keep an eye on things around that is during the sample installation. But as far as runtime, you should not run into any issues around 32 versus 64. I remember spending plenty of time around that, and especially around testing. So should work, and if it doesn't, definitely something you want to reach out to Microsoft and report.
Thank you, Brendon, and thank you, everyone, for all of your great questions. If anyone has any more questions, please feel free to type them in at this time. In the meantime, I'm going to click through a few polling questions, and we would greatly appreciate your feedback. The first question, was this content helpful for your business? Yes or no? Great, thank you, everyone. Second question, please rate the presentation content. Excellent, good, or poor? And let me see if I can refresh. There we go. Sorry, everyone, the polls were closed for a moment. Great, thank you. Last question. Would you like us to schedule a follow-up? Yes or no? Great, thank you, everyone. If there are no further questions, we'd like to thank Brendon again for this wonderful presentation. We will be forwarding out a link to view the recording of today's webcast once it becomes available. If you have any further questions about this presentation, please feel free to email Brendon. And Brendon, I believe you had your email address on that first slide, correct?
Yes, it's on the first slide.
Let me see if I can pull it up for everybody. Oh, one moment. There you go, everybody. There's Brendon's email address. Again, thank you so much, everyone, for joining us. We look forward to seeing you on our next webcast. You are now free to disconnect. Thank you.